Hey everyone, and welcome to this video, which is going to be the first one of the section on c-betting imposition versus a big blind call from pre-flop. And this first video is going to be about when the board is high and connected. And by connected, I mean that there are 3 cards to a straight on the board, so players could have a straight. I'm going to start by talking about the overall strategies, so the frequencies and sizings, sort of go from our theory of betting, frequency and sizings, to now applying those to a very real scenario with real ranges, real players playing. And then I'm going to move on to a bit of discussion about hand selection, how you should play individual hands, and a little bit about exploitation at the end. So I hope this video is going to be useful for you. Just checking that I'm actually recording this time. Yes, I am. That's good. I've already tried to record about 20-25 minutes of this. I was rambling away to the camera for that long and then suddenly realised I wasn't even recording it. So, it's easily done. But this time we're good. So, yes, here's the programme, the screen here. And this is for the button versus the big blind. So it's played a bunch of hands, button versus big blind, and I've now filtered for spots where the imposition player is about to act, as in, are they going to c-bet or not? And I filtered flops for jack high or higher and got rid of any paired flops. So I'll now just sort of go through some of the relevant flops. In the first attempt, where I wasn't actually recording, I was going through way too many of them, I think, and I'll try and do a bit fewer because we don't want this video to last all day, but I assure you I have looked through them, all the relevant ones, even if I'm not going through them in detail. So let's start with ace, king, queen suited. Two cards of a suit, and let's open up the big blind range and the button range. Only once is necessary, so let's get these on the screen so you guys can see them, and let's do that. Okay, so the first thing to note with the sort of range makeups, like how they match up against each other, is that we have this huge advantage at the top of the ranges for the button. So we've got 3.4% straights, 1.9% trips, and 5.7% two pairs, whereas our opponent in the big blind has only got 1.7% straights, no trips, and only 0.5% two pairs. So overall, that ends up being 11% for us of two pair or better, and only 2.2% for our opponent. So we just have this 11% of hands, which is quite happy betting pretty much any size, as big as you want, because they're almost never beaten by our opponent, essentially. And then as you sort of go down through the ranges, that we can expand the sort of one pairs there and expand the one pairs here as well. And you can see that 19% top pairs for our opponent in the big blind, whereas we've got 22%, so slightly ahead on the top pairs as well. And then it gets more even as you get to second pairs and third pairs. So when you start looking at, say, second pairs, then 47% of our range is second pair or better, whereas only 36% of our opponent's range is second pair or better. But that's really driven by this advantage at the top of the range, where we've just got so many more very strong hands than our opponent does. Also, not only do we have this sort of strategy driven by the top end hands in terms of where our range advantage is, but also when you look at our marginal hands, the sort of the weak ace X, the king X, the queen X, and so on, they don't really have great bluff equity, because most of the hands that villain's going to be folding versus a small bet, so we don't have a small bet option here, but we'll just look at the range versus the bigger bet. But you can see how many of these hands are just under pairs and random, like 9-7, 9-8, etc., which have almost no equity versus our marginal hands. So we don't have a ton of bluff equity there, but we do get a lot of folds relative to our bet size, so that increases it somewhat. And when we do this bigger size, we get folds from pairs and gut shots, which is pretty good for us. But if we were to try and use a smaller size to be able to bet all of our marginal hands, then we wouldn't really have much bluff equity at all. So that's kind of why we end up here with the strategy we do, which is that we are betting 0.78 times pot, so about 3/4 pot, 58% of the time, and 1.44 times pot, so we've got an overbet size as well, 13% of the time. I would probably recommend not trying to implement the overbet size unless it's in an exploitative way, because this is pretty much the only one of these boards where an overbet is used. It's just the very highest, and it's where we've got this biggest advantage at the top of the ranges. So we have excess very strong hands even above the what we're putting into the 3/4 pot range, and therefore we can have this overbet range. But our overall strategy of betting sort of a mid-high frequency here, so 65-70% of the time at a size of about 3/4 pot is pretty solid, and I hope you guys can sort of understand why that strategy is the way that it is, given how the range makeups and bluff equity and so on is between the different hands. So I wanted next to look at an ace queen jack. So we can see that ace king jack goes a little bit smaller on the bet size. So I know I've done a video explaining how this program works a little bit, but just a refresher because I know it's still early in the course. So we've got our ace king queen flop here, and we've got the call column, so calling 29% on ace king queen, and then we can see it matches it to the nearest one of these sort of standard bet sizings and tells you how often it bets this size and how often it bets the overbet size. Ace king jack, we've got rid of the overbets and we're going a bit smaller. Ace queen jack is very similar, and we're going to have a look at why that is. So let's open up the respective ranges here for the big blind and the button. So get it on the screen so you can see it again. And yeah, so now at the top end of the ranges, we've still got roughly the same amount of straights, trips and two pairs. We still got all of them basically, but our opponent has more straights and two pairs than they did beforehand. So they've now got 5.1%. So our range advantage at the very top of the range is smaller than it was on the ace king queen, and that's why we see the excess overbets dropping out, and we just have this size of about 3/4 pot, which we're going to use. And also that sort of carries down through the ranges, so we end up with like a slightly lower frequency than we did on the ace king queen, where we were betting about 70%. But still, when we're trying to implement this, we're still going for roughly a mid-high frequency and the 3/4 pot sizing. So it's going to be roughly the same here, but I'm just kind of showing you that we are starting to lose a bit of strength already as the flop even gets very slightly lower than it was originally. So we then have the next king queen jack, where we've gone down on frequency again. We're a little bit less strong again. Villain's got ace 10 and 10-9 straights and more two pairs, so our range is a little bit less strong at the top end, and we definitely don't have any overbets, and we're decreasing our frequency a little bit to more of a mid frequency on the king queen jack. And the king queen 9, we're now starting to get some more. First of all, again, we're a little bit less strong again, but then we're also starting to get more of our sort of marginal hands having bluff equity, like pretty good bluff equity, because Villain's having to fold some jack X and some 10X versus our small bets, and as well as ace X for an overcard versus all of our pairs. So we end up having the smaller sizing now on the king queen 9, as well as the larger size of about 75% pot, and this smaller size actually gets used more often than the 75% pot. And as we go down again through to a slightly smaller one, so we've now got queen jack 10, and we're going to take a look at this one because at first glance this looks like really different to the others. We're betting all the time essentially, and our most common size by far is about half pot. So let's have a quick look at why that is. We've got the big blind range here and the button range here, and we can see that we're doing really well at the top of the ranges here. We've got the ace king where our opponent hasn't, and so on, and we've end up with quite a lot of straight trips and two pairs, so really strong at the top of the ranges. Our opponent, on the other hand, while they don't have ace king, they still are much stronger at the top of the ranges than they were on sort of the much higher boards that we've looked at already. So we've actually got 17% of our ranges two pair or better, whereas only about 9% of our opponent's ranges two pair or better. But still, that's 9%. If you think back to the ace king queen, our opponent only had 2% of two pair or better. So we had this really big chunk of 11% of hands, which once bet really big. Whereas here we have a much a broad selection of hands, so 17%, so more of our hands, but they only beat 91% of our opponent's range rather than 98%. So they're not so keen to bet such a large size. And also, as we go down through our ranges, we're actually stronger on this board than we were on the other ones. So we've got more than 30% of our hands are top pair or better, compared to only 17.5% of our opponent's range. And similar with two pair, it's 40% versus 25%, and so on. So right down through our ranges, we've got this big advantage. And now, if we look at how the big blind has to play, even versus a quarter pot bet, they're having to fold quite a lot of these ace-x hands without a backdoor flush draw, which have an overcard and a gut shot. So all of our board pairs, all our queen-x, all our jack-x, all our 10x, is pretty happy to see these hands folding, unless, of course, they've got the draws themselves and they're dominating them. But for the most part, our marginal hands here really have pretty good bluff equity, so they're pretty inclined to bet. And also we can see there's 9x folding quite a bit, open-ended straight draw. So this is obviously great for our marginal hands. And that's why we end up wanting a strategy that leaves us betting basically 100% of the time, because we just have this really broad range of hands. We have over half of our hands are third pair or better, and they're all just really inclined to bet. And then we obviously need to balance them with our air hands and so on to build our range. So we end up 100% betting, and we'd just be using a size of about half pot or a little bit smaller. And if we were to go to the Queen Jack 9, we would see that our bluff equity gets even. Well, our bluff equity is still very good, but our ranges are a little bit less strong. We just end up with betting almost all the time, but betting a little bit smaller. And then we have some, with the smaller size, we have some excess strong hands, and we have a larger size as well, but it's still only about 3/4 pot. We'd probably ignore that. And if we go down to a Jack 10-9, then we have a smaller range advantages on Jack 10-9. Our opponent has a lot of straights and two pairs and so on. And that's why we end up with, despite our smaller size, only betting a mid-high frequency of about 65%, with about third pot. And then down to the smallest one, which I'm going to look at in a bit more detail again, we've got Jack 10-8, and we can see our strategy here is betting, is actually betting 0.2 times pots, which is a min c-bet. So let's have a look at why that is. I'll get these up, and okay, so on this Jack 10-8, we're actually getting quite close at the top of the ranges. So our opponent actually has 4.4% straights, you can see here, compared to 4% straights for us. And then as we go through two pair plus, we do get a bit of an advantage. We have 10% two pair plus against just 8% for our opponent. And then once you add in that we've got aces through queens and our opponent doesn't, that ends up with having 13.5% versus the 8% of queen plus. So we still got a pretty good advantage, not right at the top of the ranges, but just below that, like really good advantage towards the top of the ranges. And then that kind of carries through. So we've got more than 25% versus 17% of top pair plus, and 36% versus 27% of second pair plus, and so on. So we keep this advantage sort of throughout the ranges. And now when we look at how opponent is reacting to our min c-bet, they're having to fold a bunch of these hands with overcards like ace-x, king-x, and even some 7x, which hands like ace-7 as well, with sort of an overcard and a gut shot, versus this really very small bet. So we've got a bunch of all of our marginal hands, our jack-x, 10x, 8x. They're getting quite a few hands that have got decent equity versus them to fold. So they've got pretty high bluff equity here, and we end up with sort of the lack of advantage right at the top of the range, and also the good bluff equity with our marginal hands. We end up betting a pretty small size, and as often as we can with that. Well, I mean, the smallest size we could possibly bet, and as often as we can with that, which is about 80% of the time. So a high frequency. So that's about it for these high connected boards on button versus big blind. So just to sort of go over that again and summarize, we've got at the very highest of boards, we're wanting to bet 3/4 pot with about a mid-high frequency, and we've sort of discussed why that's the case. We've got these big range advantages, but our marginal hands don't have great bluff equity. So we end up with this strategy of 3/4 pot, mid-high frequency, and maybe even some overbets on an ace, king, queen. Then as we go down sort of through the boards towards lower ones, as we get to Queen Jack 10, we end up having just this. Queen Jack 10 is a bit of a special one, but we just have this really big range advantage there throughout, and we end up betting about half pot. But you can kind of see the sizings going down as we go through that, and then as we got to Jack 10-9, it was down to about third pot, and Jack 10-8 down to literally a min c-bet. So we've got this whole range of sizings going from high, like big sizings, to small sizings as the flop is getting lower, and our frequencies are like starting with a base frequency of about mid to high is pretty good, and that works very well at the top end. And then as it gets through to the Queen Jack 10, they actually go up to very high, always C betting, and then it drops off just a little bit to about a high frequency with Jack 10-8. And at the end, I'll summarise with maybe even a slightly simpler strategy than that, but that's, I think, a good understanding of how things are moving around as the board changes, and hopefully the reasons why that's the case as I've gone through the examples. So after looking at that, we can sort of ask ourselves the question, does this also hold for other positions versus the big blind? Is this going to be exactly the same? Should we have the same sizings, the same frequencies? And the answer, sadly, is not exactly, but it's not too bad, actually. So we'll have a quick look at what's going on here. So essentially what happens as we are going back through the positions, so going from button to cutoff to hijack and so on, is that on these very highest of boards, our frequency is going up and our sizing is going down. And let's have a quick look at ace queen jack here to start to demonstrate why. So let's get these up here. So we can see that we're doing quite a bit better at the top of the ranges than we were button versus big blinds. We're just opening a tighter range from the cutoff than we are from the button, but also the big blind is defending a tighter range than they were versus a button open. So both players are kind of getting stronger at the top end. When we had the ace queen jack flop on button versus big blind, we had 11% versus 5% two pair plus, whereas in this one here we've got 17% two pair plus, and our opponent's got nearly 7% two pair plus, 6.7. So both players have got stronger, and that's just making us less inclined to bet the really big sizes that we were button versus big blind, so our sizings come down slightly. But our range is kind of more different, cutoff versus button, compared to the big blind versus cutoff or versus button. So our range, as we get lower in the ranges, is our range advantage is bigger than it was button versus big blind. So our sizings kind of our sizings go down a bit, but our frequency goes up as our more marginal hands are, like we have more of them that are wanting to bet slightly a smaller size. So let's go on to hijack versus big blind now, and we can see again if we go to the ace king queen here. So this was a spot where button versus, so this is the big blind range, and the versus a c bet, and this is the c betting range. So button versus big blind on the ace king queen, this was where we really had the biggest sizings and mid-high frequency with it, and we can see that we're actually betting a third pot most of the time here. We've retained some of the top end sizing for the hijack, but yeah, we've really drastically moved our strategy in this direction. And if we look at the range advantage numbers here, we've now our opponent's got the same number of straights as us, and has got quite a few more two pairs. So whereas button versus big blind, our opponent only had 2.2% of two pair or better, now they've got 6.1%. So you can kind of see immediately why we're not going quite as crazy with the big sizes. But for us, we have way more as well. So we have like 19% two pair or better. So we've got a much greater volume of hands that are strong, but they're not quite as strong relative to our opponent as they were button versus big blind. And this advantage again is just really huge as we go through the ranges, and we've got 41% of our range being top pair or better, which is pretty big, and our opponent only has 24%. So we end up with our sizes shifting down. And if you're thinking, which would be a reasonable thought, that the marginal hands still don't have very good bluff equity, so surely we should still be betting this sort of bigger sizing rather than the small one. The answer is that even versus our versus our smaller size here, we can see that versus a third pot bet, the big blind is folding a bunch of jack X and a bunch of 10X that I'm sort of hovering over here. So if we hover over the fold range to filter for that, then 22% of the folding range is a gut shot, and 35% of it is a pair, although a lot of those will be the under pairs, but it's also folding some queen X and so on. So we're getting a lot more folds from reasonable strength hands than we were button versus big blind, just because because big blind's range is stronger overall, so their hands that they're folding end up being stronger. So that's why we have this sort of effect of the sizing going down quite a lot, but the frequency going up as we go back through the back through the positions on the very highest of these boards. And just to go back to under the gun versus button to demonstrate what happens on the lower of the board, so the Jack 10-8, we can see that here our sizing's actually gone up. So what's happening as we're going back through the positions is that things have really kind of evened out a lot more in terms of our sizings. So whereas we were starting button versus big blind with these really big sizings on the highest boards down to really small sizings on the lower of the boards, now it's evening out much more to around about half pot on quite a lot of the boards. And the good news is with something like Queen Jack 10, you can see here we're betting always again and mostly doing about half pot still. So we can kind of use the same strategy as we were button versus big blind for the ones in the middle, and then we're just shifting the ones at the top downwards in terms of sizing, but upwards in frequency, and the ones at the bottom are just frequency's going down, but the sizing's going up. And we'll just have a quick look at the ranges here to explain why that's the case for under the gun versus button. If we get these up onto the screen. So here we now have our top end is very, very similar between under the gun and the big blind. So we've actually got 8.1% two pair plus from under the gun, whereas the big blind has 8.5% two pair plus. So we've actually got a slight disadvantage at the very top of the ranges now. But then we do have all these queens, kings and aces, which are a much bigger percentage of our range now that our range is much tighter for opening. So we have 17% queens plus, and the big blind still doesn't have any queens, kings or aces, so they've still only got 8.5% of queens or better. But then as we go into our top pairs, if I open these up, we can see that we've got 12% top pair versus 13%, 12% second pair versus 12%, and so on. So our advantage isn't increasing at all as we go down through the ranges. So we end up with really our queens, kings, and high top pairs end up dominating our strategies a little bit more, and rather than the button versus big blind where we end up with this really small size, here we end up with a quite a bit bigger size, but doing it less often. So that's about it for the sort of frequencies and sizings. Let me bring in this little conclusion that I've got here to try and sum this up. So when we're taking away how do we want to play on these boards, what do we want our overall strategies to be, we want to bet mid to high frequencies with a sizing of around 3/4 pot on the higher boards on which we're strongest. And then the sizing decreases as the flop gets lower, all the way down to min betting on Jack 10-8 suited. And remember, in the middle of that with the Queen Jack 10 or so, we're betting all the time. Our frequency is going all the time. And as our sizing decreases, in general, our mid-high is kind of a good base point, but then we are just increasing it for the Queen Jack 10, and Jack 10-8 is about a high frequency as well, where the sizing really gets very small. So, yep, and then as we go back towards under the gun opening, our very high connected flop strategies go towards always c-betting, but mostly with a smaller size. And they will often still include a pot range as well, though, which I think is probably worth doing for exploitative reasons, which I'll get to at the end of the video. But yeah, so we're mostly going for a small sizing, but including some pots as well, because we do still have this quite big advantage at the top of the range. But the lower end of our high connected flops is going the other way, with our frequency getting lower, but our sizing getting bigger. So let's get that out the way. And let's go through a bit of hand selection. So let's have a look at how we're going to play hands in some different scenarios, because it's all very well knowing our overall strategies, but we need to know how to play the actual hand we've got. So let's start by looking at Ace, King, Queen suited, and this is, again, let's just open this one for now. So this is just the button range, and this is button versus big blind again. And we can see that we're very rarely, well, never in fact, checking our straights. And let me back up for a second actually and talk a little bit about why we slow play top end hands and why we might not in other situations, because this is going to apply to all of all the spots we're looking at, but I'll sort of go through it now because it's the first one, and then maybe refer to it later. So essentially, we need to slow play top end hands in situations where the villain will be able to play aggressively against us on the next streets if we don't. And there'll be kind of 4 reasons why this might be the case, or 4 factors to consider. So the first is how strong villain's range is versus our check range. So when we have a very high, very big range advantage, especially at the top of the ranges, then we're not going to have to slow play our top end hands so often, because if we've, say, like we do in this scenario, we've got 11% 2 pair plus versus just 2%. So even if we bet our top end hands a very high percentage of the time, our opponent is still not going to have a particularly stronger range than us on some like blank 5 turn or something, because they're still only going to have a small percentage of their range being top end hands. So that's sort of the first factor that makes us not slow play so much if we've got big range advantage at the top. Another thing is how likely we are to hit other strong hands on the turn. So if we have, say, a random board like ace-8 deuce, or well, maybe choose something different like 10-8 deuce. On a 10-8 deuce board, if we don't slow play any sets, still, whatever turn comes, we're probably going to hit new sets, because we're going to be checking pocket 9 sometimes, we're going to be checking pocket 7s and 6s and 5s sometimes, and so on. So if any of those cards come, we're going to hit top end hands on those cards. And if an overcard comes, we're going to be checking back lots of cards that will make new 2 pairs, or at least new top pairs and so on. So we're not going to have to slow play very often with our top end hands on those sort of boards. On other boards, we're going to have to do it a lot. So take, for example, a monotone board. If we don't check any of our flushes on a monotone board and the turn is a blank, our opponent's going to have a ton of flushes in their range and we're going to have none. So we're going to be able to we might have to face big sizings and high frequencies from our opponent, and we're not really going to have the range to sort of back it up and deal with that. And the same would be true on paired boards. Like if you never check trips on a paired board, then the turn is some blank, then our opponent has loads of trips and we don't have any. And the same to a lesser extent, but still important, when there's a straight on the board, like we have here. So when there's a straight on the board and our opponent can have the straight, then if we are not checking any top end hands, then on the turns, opponent's going to be able to have the straight and we're not going to be able to have the straight, and that's going to cause us some problems. But in this case, the opponent only has the straight very rarely, so it's not such a big deal. And it would be more of a big deal on, say, a board like Queen Jack 10, if we were ever checking on the Queen Jack 10, on that sort of board where our opponent can have King 9 and 9-8, they could have 2 different straights, then that's more of a problem. But so we've got 2 things so far. As the first is how strong our top end of the range is versus our opponents, and the second is what the board texture is and whether we're going to hit new top end hands on various turns. The third thing is, the more polarized our range is, then the more top end hands we're going to need to check back on average. So if we're betting a big size and not very often, especially, then we're going to have this big checking range of hands that are sort of in the middle. And if we have that without slow playing any top end hands, then as long as our villain has some strong hands themselves, on average on the turn, they're going to be able to bet pretty big versus our average range and exploit us that way. So if we're betting a very merged range where we have all sorts of hands in our range which are sort of almost the top end hands, because we're like betting sometimes and checking sometimes with pretty much all our hands, then we don't need to check so often with our very top end hands. Whereas if we have this block of hands that we're just betting pretty much without really checking very often, because we're betting this polarized range, then we're going to have to check some from the very top end just to make sure our checking range isn't too weak. And then the final thing to consider is just blockers. So if, for example, we're betting, say, a big size on an ace 10-4 or whatever it is, and with pocket aces, we might want to check quite a bit if quite a large percentage of our opponent's continuing range versus our big bet is ace-x. So it might just be that aces has pretty high EV check compared to all our other very strong hands because of the just blocker effects and the fact that when we check, we're then going to face bets on the turn from our opponent, but when we bet, we're getting a lot of folds with a very strong hand, which isn't ideal. So those are kind of the 4 things that we need to consider, and we'll try and keep those in mind as we go forward. But on the ace, king, queen, we know that we had this big sort of range advantage at the top of the range, so we're not having to slow play too often. and when we do, it's usually with aces, because our opponent's folding pretty often versus the big bet, and as I've said, a lot of the defending range is going to be aces, so that's why we're checking back quite a lot of aces. Kings are barely ever checking, and queens are never checking, and straights were never checking. Also, two pair is barely ever checking, so just ace king with a spade, king of spades, and that'll just be because the opponent's continuing more king x with the king of spades. But something I would advise you avoid doing is trying to look too closely into sort of what we're doing with hand with a backdoor flush draw versus no backdoor flush draw versus pair plus draw versus pair and no draw and so on, because I've been down that road, and let me tell you, you think you found these wonderful explanations, and then you look at a different flop and you're just like, oh, it's totally the opposite. So yeah, I remember when I first got my first solver, I thought, right, I'm going to just understand everything at the deepest possible level. I looked at my first flop and I was looking at every single spot in huge detail of like, okay, so we're betting like king of diamonds, eight of hearts here, this frequency, and king of hearts, eight of spades, this different frequency. Let's try and work out why that is. And I'd come up with possible reasons, and then look at another spot and think, oh, that confirms it, I think. And then, yeah, next spot I look at is totally the opposite. And yeah, basically solvers aren't even 100% accurate in terms of solving the game totally. And most of the time there will be a reason for these things, but it's going to be so hard to actually use it in game, because it's like the reason for it can be very, very subtle. Like the exact pre-flop ranges that lead to our opponent calling and folding certain hands, and therefore that makes us want to play certain blockers slightly differently from others and so on. So sometimes there'll be good reasons for it, and it will be even obvious and you can do it, but a lot of the time I would just kind of look for the overall broad, how we playing different hand types, rather than getting into too much specifics. But yeah, so if we go into our one pairs, we can see that we're betting very often with our high top pairs, and this is going to be very standard throughout lots of different situations. Essentially, we're betting more often with the better kickers, especially when we've got extra value with the gut shot with the ace jack and ace 10 here, and then it's just gradually going down. We're betting the lower top pairs much less often. And note though that we're not just betting, say, ace 7 100% of the time and ace deuce 10%. We are having it much more sort of spread out, and you want to kind of start with your overall frequency of mid to high here, and then just adjust it so that when we've got good hands to bet, we're betting more often than mid to high, and going up to the very good hands to bet like the straights and the ace jacks and kings and queens and so on, we're just betting those 100% of the time. And then as it gets slightly less clear, like ace 9 ace 8, we're betting like 80-90% of the time, and then ace deuce, yeah, betting about half the time. And the really sort of, because we're betting quite a big size, it would be different if we're betting small size, but we're betting quite a big size here with hands like king x, that's really sort of right in that middle of the marginal hand range, but we're not betting a small size. Then you can just check pretty much always with a bunch of those hands, given that we've got such this polarized range. But then note that we do start betting again with the queen x, which has kind of got some bluff equity, because if we bet 3/4 pot, we can see that the opponent should be folding a bunch of queen x and a bunch of king x. So when we've got queen x, we've actually got some decent bluff equity of getting better hands to fold, which have great equity versus us. And then yes, just jacks and tens are loving betting, and bluffing a lot with the sort of jack x, 10x, so the gut shots, but not 100% of the time. And then betting sort of a varying amount depending on where we've got backdoor and flush draws and so on with our air. But essentially here we're checking our total air most of the time. So high frequency of checking perhaps, or low frequency of betting, and then with our backdoor flush draws it's much more like a high frequency of betting. So we're still not going to the extremes of 100% bet, 100% check with different hands. And if you struggle to sort of implement these, like if you're not using a randomizer while you play, then feel free to just go to 100% with backdoor. Well, yeah, I mean, you can feel free. People aren't really going to notice. It's not going to make a big difference. Personally, I prefer trying to keep the ranges just more balanced and making sure there's no way people are going to be able to exploit whether I've got backdoor flush draws or not in checking ranges and so on. But it's not really a huge deal. If you don't use a randomizer, then just choose some hands to bet all the time and some others to bet 0%. One other thing that I want to go through quickly here is just how these pocket pairs play. So pocket pairs will in general bet a lot less often than the surrounding board pairs, but just because they've got fewer outs, they do worse in big pots. So when you've, say the board is ace, jack, 8, you're going to bet Jack X and 8X a lot more often than pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 7s, because you've got outs to hit 2 pair. So you've got 5 outs to hit 2 pair plus and be able to get future value in a bigger pot. Whereas when you've just got the pocket pair, you've only got 2 outs to really improve. So the pocket pairs prefer in general to bet less often and check more and try and get a cheaper showdown. So we see that here. So the 9s are checking a very large amount of the time, basically always without the spade, and the same with 8s. And then we start to bet more with the lower ones, which again will be very common, betting more with the lower pocket pairs than the higher ones, because their value equity is pretty similar in that they beat roughly the same percentage of the opponent's range. But when you are having the lower pairs, they've got much better bluff equity because they're folding out hands with overcards much more often. So I think that was very long, but yep, that's good for the ace, king, queen. And then I was going to take a quick look at king, queen, 9. So here we're betting a much higher frequency, and we see that when we don't have such a polarized range, it's much less clear. Our hands like Queen X, you don't just get this big block of Queen X that's just pretty much always checking like you did with the King X when we were betting the bigger size on the Ace, King, Queen. So our range is much more merged here, and you're much more thinking about tweaking. If we're c-betting a high frequency on this board, you're tweaking up to 100% with a lot of hands and down to, say, a mid-high frequency with hands that aren't so good to c-bet, other than these, again, pocket pairs just below the 9s, just below 9x, so 8s and 7s and 6s and 5s, and again going up, so you can see the same pattern of betting more with the lower pocket pairs. Looking at the top end on this board, we can see again we're if you go down to the bottom here, you can see when I've hovered over straight that we're only checking back 1.6%, so basically never checking back our straights, basically never checking back our trips, and pretty rarely with our 2 pairs. So again, with our nice top end advantage, we don't need to slow play a ton of very strong hands. Although we do still need to sometimes, because we do have this straight problem that if we're not checking any, like a villain has enough top end hands that they're going to be able to play very aggressively versus us if we're never checking back strong hands and the turn comes like a blank 4 or something. So then I wanted to have one last look at Jack 10-9. And yeah, so here villain has, way better top end, like he's way stronger at the top end than villain is on the other situations we've looked at. So now we're actually having to slow play sometimes. We can see overall with our straights we're now checking 14% compared to the basically never we were seeing on the previous ones we looked at. And I wouldn't, in general, we're doing it less with king queen and more with 9-8, but more with 8-7, sorry, and in the middle with queen 9. So again, just kind of betting more often with the strongest hands and less often with the weaker hands within this sort of category of straights. I wouldn't worry about the fact that we're checking more with the king of spades here than with king queen. That'll just be some like random reason that's very subtle. Sorry, I didn't mean to actually close that just yet. So let's bring it back up here. But yes, just remember that this is because the opponent has 9% of 2 pair plus in their range, so we need to be slow playing much more. And we can see with 2 pairs here, we're actually checking about the same percentage as our overall check percentage. So that's really quite high for such a strong hand. And yeah, that's you just need to bear this in mind. If you're playing against weaker players who are just never ever going to take advantage of that, obviously you don't need to worry about it. Whether or not you should still do it or not is a different question though, as to whether you should worry about it, because sometimes people might just, you say a Jack 10-9 board, for example, people are going to have all sorts of draws and so on, so they might be betting too often on the turn after you check back the flop, just because they have this very basic idea of like, oh, I bet my top pairs and my draws on the turn, and they just have quite a lot of top pair plus and they have quite a lot of draws on the turn, so actually they might be betting too often on the turn And so even though you don't need to sort of worry that your opponent is going to be hugely exploiting you deliberately, if you don't check back strong hands, you might want to do it anyway, because it might still be pretty good EV to check strong hands given the how your opponent plays. So the other thing, again, we're seeing this other than, and this was similar in the other boards, I didn't mention it, but when the under pair has, when the pocket pair has a straight draw as well, it will often bet more, even though it's a pocket pair, because it does have those extra outs there. It's not just playing two outs in big pots. But as soon as you get down to sevens and then especially sixes, we're just checking all the time with our pocket pairs that are just, underneath the board pairs. So that's very much the same. We also check aces quite a lot on Jack 10-9, and we'll find this quite often in scenarios where we don't expect our opponent to bet ace-x on the turn a lot. So here we're betting with ace of spades, and this is one of those occasions where there is a pretty easy to explain reason for it, and that's because on the turn our opponent might be betting the ace of spades because we've got two spades on the board, and there could be a third on the turn, for example, or even if there's not a third on the turn, they're going to be betting sometimes for the ace of spades so that they've got the ace of spades as a bluff on flush rivers. But when we don't have the ace of spades, it's kind of a pretty good strongish hand to check back, because we're going to face turn bets more often because we don't block hands that are going to be betting on the turn as a bluff, and it's not like it's hugely strong in terms of being happy to face check raises and future action and so on. So we're quite happy to check with it. And whereas with kings and queens, first of all, kings and queens have better bluff equity in betting because they're getting ace-x to fold, whereas ace-x, is not so worried about that. But also kings and queens have the straight draw here as well, so they're more happy facing further aggression than aces is. So it's quite clear why we check aces back there. And then we can see that we're like hands like ace-9 and king-9, queen-9, these are kind of the part of our range which is the sort of middle part of our range. And even though we're betting quite a small size, it's not so much that we're betting a small size because we're betting this hugely wide range like we were in the previous one we looked at. We're betting a small size partly because our opponent's quite strong at the top end, so our marginal hands are not so keen to bet really wide. So we do have a bit of this sort of in the middle of our ranges, checking pretty often with our sort of middle of our range type hands here, like ace-9. So I believe that was everything I wanted to say on this. Yep. So yeah, I think that's roughly covered hand selection. I hope that was kind of clear. So just kind of summarizing that we're checking back our top end hands, thinking about those four factors that I talked about of how strong we are at top of ranges compared to our opponent, how often we're going to hit, like how often we're not hitting turns if we don't check back now, and then blockers and the other one, which was how polarized our range is. So yeah, that's how we're sort of working out our top end hands. And then we're remembering that with pocket pairs, we're going to be betting less often than with surrounding board pairs because they only have two outs to improve. So they're better off playing small pots rather than making the pot bigger and not being very likely to improve. And then with our air, or with our bluff type hands, we're not just betting all of our draws and checking back all of our air without draws. We're very much mixing it up. We'll generally be betting more, like the better our hands are to bluff. The more equity our hands have as a bluff hand, in general, we're betting them more often. But we're just trying to make our betting range stronger than our checking range. We're not trying to just put all of our decent bluffs into our betting range, and then when draws hit on the turn with our checking range, we just never have them, and so on. Or when draws do hit with our betting range, we just never have bluffs because we've just always been, all our bluffs have had pretty good equity. So yeah, I think that is it for hand selection. So just a very brief word on exploitation. The main thing that I spotted, so that's kind of obvious here, is, let me bring it up. So on an ace king queen board, for example, if we look at how our opponent should be playing versus our big bets, then they should be folding some maybe slightly counterintuitive hands. So this is only versus a 3/4 pot bet, but villain should be folding a bunch of King X without backdoor flush draw, loads of Queen X, even like Queen 9 with a backdoor flush draw, and all these gutters and so on. So I feel like naturally, because we kind of have this, I think the way our minds work as sort of a standard is that we have this idea of, okay, we continue with pairs and draws versus a c-bet. And then we try and adjust that based on the sizing and the board texture and so on. But I think it's hard to adjust that properly in all spots. So in spots where we just have very few decent hands and lots of air, it's very easy to end up overfolding. And in spots like this where we've hit the board pretty well, but our opponents hit the board really well, and we actually need to be folding quite a lot, then I think it's going to be quite easy for a lot of people to just be calling all this King X, calling all this Queen X, and thinking, you know, I've hit a pair on the flop, just not even thinking about it, I'm just going to check call, and then think about it on the turn. So if that is the case, then what we want to be doing is we want to have a higher barrel frequency on the turn, because our opponent has too weak a range coming into the turn. So we're going to polarize our betting range on the flop a little more even, probably end up betting a little less often, because we're not going to be betting with air hands that we're likely to only bet one street with, because if GTO is that our air hands have equivalent EV of checking and betting when our opponent's folding 57%, if our opponent was, say, folding 45%, obviously they're going to have higher EV of checking now if they're sort of an air hand. But we also want to be able to double barrel, because our opponent might end up folding too much on the turn. So they might just have all these hands which, the King X, Queen X, etc., which should have folded the flop, but now they're still going to fold a bunch on the turn and maybe the river, but they're just going to, essentially we want to have less hands that are betting one street and giving up, and more hands that are betting 2 or 3 streets. So we're going to reduce our flop frequency somewhat, but then when we do bet with air, we're going to continue bluffing it a lot of the time on the turn and river to put pressure on our opponent's weaker range. And it's important too to not just get rid of the rubbish air from c-betting the flop, because we still want to be able to bluff when the board comes in with like 4 straight or 3 flush or whatever it is. So we need to be bluffing a range of betting a range of weak hands on the flop, which can bluff on all sorts of different turns and rivers, but we're just doing it less often on the flop, but then continuing more often on the turn. But I'm kind of reluctant to prescribe too much exact exploits to use, because things change. You know, anybody who now watches this video is going to be like, oh, I need to fold more versus c-bets on these boards. So if you're then trying to exploit it and they've watched this video, you're not going to be doing very well against it. So it depends who you're playing against, it depends which games you're in, but I would definitely recommend for this and pretty much every other spot is creating an alias on Hold'em Manager. I think you can do it in NoteCaddie. It's not something I did myself too much because I played quite a small specific pool of players, but if you're playing a wider pool of players, then I think making aliases and filtering for certain types of boards and seeing how often your opponents actually fold versus different sizings on those boards, and finding so when I say creating aliases, I mean, you know, for like a big group of your opposition. So you're kind of finding out how the crowd play and maybe do it for a bunch of regs. You could even split them into different types of regs if you want, but even just doing it for a whole bunch of regs that play your stakes, or if you play anonymous games, then obviously you just have to do it for everyone. But just working out whether people are overfolding or underfolding on different board types, and then adjusting your strategies accordingly. It's going to be a decent little addition to your EV and not super high effort. I mean, the actual thing of creating the alias and working out stuff is going to be pretty high effort, but then you can use that for all these different spots, and like every time I'm explaining how to do something, or like how you might exploit someone, you can test it versus your actual opponents in your games and see how people are playing and exploit appropriately. And yeah, it's just like I say, I would say for the most part, if you want to be thinking, if you're playing someone who's not really a big thinker, you know, they've probably not watched these videos, they've probably not used solvers a ton, they've maybe used them a bit and watched a couple of videos, but they've not really thought about it a lot, then in general, when you have a really strong range and they have they've hit quite a lot, then they're probably going to not fold enough because they're just playing the standard thing of like calling pairs. And when, like I say, when they've hit very rarely, they might be folding too much because, again, they're kind of playing the standard thing of continuing pairs and some ace high maybe or whatever, but they don't have enough hands of that strength to continue as often as they should. So yes, this has ended up being a long video. The others on the different types of flops are going to be a bit shorter because I think I've gone over in this video a lot of the more general stuff as well. So I hope you'll join me for those, and I hope you learn a lot from them. And then at the end of these videos, I'm going to create a summary. So I imagine it's somewhat difficult to follow everything I'm saying here and really remember it. So if I get everything together in some PowerPoint slides or whatever for you guys, then hopefully you can just take from it this relatively basic strategy of how to play on different board types, but with this sort of built-up understanding from these longer videos of why everything is the case, that will kind of jog your memory and help you when you're in game to actually play what you've learned, rather than just having to try and memorize it with nothing really there to explain why, and then it's very difficult. So yeah, that's it for now, guys, and I hope to see you in the next video, which is going to be playing on lower connected boards.